Guys, welcome to the podcast. Before we get started, as ever, remember that all the information you're about to hear is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure or prevent any illnesses or diseases. Please make sure to consult your healthcare practitioner before implementing any of the things we may discuss in this podcast. Speaking of education, if you're an exercise professional, coach or anyone working within the realms of health and fitness, when you're done listening here, make sure to head on over and check out our education portal at www.themusclementors.co.uk. If you like us and truly care about the well-being of your clients, about getting access to the best and most up-to-date information in the areas of exercise mechanics, hypertrophy, sleep, improving your online coaching services and much, much more, then be sure to join up. You'll gain access to endless hours of content focused around everything you need to become a true elite coach and get your clients in the best physical shape possible. This is all in the form of video lectures, weekly live education sessions and study groups. You also get early access to our podcast and access to any exclusive Q&A segments we do with our guests. The content never stops on the portal. It's not a one-off course. It's an ever-evolving learning platform designed to give you the best information possible in this area. Head on over to our website and become part of our epic community, full to the brim of other professionals who, like yourself, are focused on providing the best health and physique related results for their clients. Join us and them and gain the resources, support and accountability you need to become the elite of the health and fitness industry. For now though, grab yourself a pen and paper and enjoy the show. Welcome everyone. We are back with the Muscle Mentors podcast. I don't know how many months it's been. I mean, what, 10, 12, 3 years? It's good to be back. And obviously with Cal and also joined by Ross on the team as well. But we are honoured to welcome on Mr. Victor Black to cover some stuff in relation to PED usage. A lot of you will know Victor is one of the kind of leading educators in this area within the fitness industry, so it's pretty awesome to have him on. We'd probably start by just saying, like, Victor, how you doing? And if you could give us kind of a background of you as a coach, educator and bodybuilder, because obviously you're pretty, you made some waves in all those areas.
Starting to gain some ground at least. Firstly, before I begin, let me just say kudos to you guys. I became a member of the Muscle Mentors website membership site last month. Very impressed with the quality of content you guys produce. So kudos to you guys. So it's I myself, as you know, run a membership site, and I was very, very impressed with the structure, the quality, and the delivery of the information. So respect. Well done, guys. Nice job. Nice job. Cool. So yeah, I'll kick off if you like and introduce myself. I think it's fair to say that very slowly over the last, in 5 or 6 years, I've been deliberately trying to raise my profile just gradually. I think the best way to do this is to go slowly sort of thing. And we're still now just starting to get to the point whereby, most people, when you talk about people like, I'll just throw a few names out there, Dr. Scott Stevenson, and and various others. When you talk to them, everybody, there's probably another a man on the planet that doesn't know who the guy is. During, there's some, like, Broderick Chavez is quite well known as an educator and an information provider. I'm very, very, very far down the totem pole to those types of gentlemen, but I am slowly raising my profile. My background, for those that are interested, is I'm 53 years old. I'm a competitive amateur bodybuilder. I'm not a professional. My background is in weapons engineering for the military. I'm not a doctor, so the information that I provide here is not intended to be medical advice. I'm not an endocrinologist. I'm not a medical practitioner. I'm an engineer. I did, before we start off, at some point, want to introduce how I arrive at my opinions that I share publicly. So I don't know if I can do that right up front, because I think it's fair to say that there are going to be some people listening that don't know who I am, that haven't heard me speak before. And I think it's important that they understand that when I'm presenting opinion here, there is an underlying methodology to how I arrived at that opinion. And I think sharing that adds value to the conversation right up front. Is it okay if I start there?
100%. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I consider myself to be an evidence-based trainer. And what that ultimately means is, even though I have 35 years of hands-on experience in the gym, the bro, as it were, who relies principally on anecdote and observation for forming his opinion. I also respect the clinical evidence that we could consider to help us make strategic decisions in terms of our knowledge. But I don't feel that we are best served by blindly following clinical evidence. And there's a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is it's actually fairly rare that you'll find a study that is directed specifically at our tribe. Very often we're looking at evidence and trying to, draw fragments of knowledge from that, but the data is perhaps on, women when we're talking about men, or men when we're talking about women. Perhaps it's talking about people in nursing homes, or perhaps it's people we're talking with disease states like HIV, AIDS, and anemia and things like that. So I'm very interested in the clinical evidence. Very often I will quote studies, to support a point of view. But I guess I would like to just point up front, I see myself as an evidence-based practitioner where I try to blend not just a single study, because any single study that anyone presents, whether it's me or anyone else, you can always refute one study. You can always find a fault in a study. Yeah? But rather, the entire body of evidence held in clinical medical literature, what can we learn from that? And then let's take that and take it into the gym with our 3 decades of experience and merge the two together and try and form opinions that respect both worlds. Okay. And then a third layer, a respect for personal opinion. I've met a great many people in this domain that don't necessarily disagree or don't necessarily agree with my opinions, and I support that. I have no problem people refuting my opinion because there's a degree of personal opinion in things. I mean, I never underestimate the value of placebo. People will say, I did this and I experienced this outcome, and as long as they understand that, this is an opinion rather than a fact, I also believe that there's room for that personal opinion, personal preference in this whole discussion. So anything I say, guys, if you say, well, such and such a study says, I really don't have a problem with that, because we could talk about that study, we may refute it. I'm really coming from the point of view of what have I learned by immersing myself in the entire body of clinical literature for the last 3 decades, okay? And then what have I learned from trying to apply that in practice under the bar for the last 3 decades? And somewhere in the middle is where my opinion is formed. Okay.
I think we probably share some similarities in our approaches there, because that's something I've recognized within. I mean, I haven't necessarily looked into the same areas you have, but we're looking into the specifics around hypertrophy and sleep and some of those areas where you look at studies and within the context that the one study's done, it's it's interesting, but you can't take much from that on its own. And even the authors a lot of the time will say stuff like, oh yeah, well, this is interesting, but more studies need to be done, and then you get people running off with
very often if you reach out to the authors of the studies, they will completely agree with you, and it's sometimes zealots that have a particular bias that grab that study stronger than even the authors do, and want to use it as a stick to beat people with, sort of thing. So it's rarely the authors of studies that make those grandiose statements. Rarely.
100%. But I think the experience side of things is so crucial that I think a lot of people underplay. So having an approach that amalgamates the two is pretty good and refreshing to see. 100%.
Yeah, it is. I won't lie. It is a little tricky. I think it's fair to say that we are in the era of the guy that makes a statement and then presents a study afterwards to make his point. Like, it's almost like everybody's doing it to become the flavor of the month, sort of thing. And it is at times challenging, because for the layperson or the person that's not experienced with this, it's very easy to read something, because there's a study attached to it. It raises the stock of that statement. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily hold true. Maybe. It depends, of course, upon the individual reading that study's ability to interpret the quality of the information that we can draw from it, and are they cherry picking? And you can always find a study to support almost anything. Without letting us off track, right now there's a great debate around the application of insulin sensitizers. Unfortunately, we have one study in a particular cohort of people that shows that large doses of metformin in 60-year-old individuals that eat 60 grams of proteins cause a little blunting effect. I have no problem with that study, but that's not me. I'm not in that cohort, so I would challenge the fact that if you did that study on me, you would find a completely different outcome. So you have to be experienced enough to be able to look at that study and take the value from that, but then knowledgeable enough to say, well, just because that's true of 65-year-old natural man, when you give him metformin at 1,700 milligrams a day, we would expect to see a reduction of testosterone, a reduction of growth factors, consequentially a reduction of insulin, and he's eating 60 grams of protein a day. Hypertrophic blunting, sure, I don't have a problem with it. That's not me. So that's probably a good point in case,
and we could talk about that area for ages of comparing. Going into study.
Study for study, agreed. I simply raise it so anyone listening to pretty much anything I see, you can see where I am coming from, where my opinions are formed from.
Cool, that's awesome. So Cal, I believe you had a bunch of stuff lined up in terms of areas you want to cover. So I'd say take it away, sir.
I want to firstly say, to me, Victor is the unsung hero of this sector of the industry. So I'm glad we can get you on to. I just don't feel as though you have the. I don't feel as though you have the following to match your knowledge and what you're putting in the industry at the moment. So I just want to say that we're grateful for what you do. But
it'll come one mind at a time. one mind at a time. I genuinely believe that 5 or 10 years from now, we will have gained a tipping point, gained momentum. It's sad to say that today many people struggle to tell the difference between entertainers and educators. And in social media, you get a lot more traction by being entertaining than by being an educator, Julian. So, but in my experience, when you reach one person, if they have respect in the industry, that one person then turns to 10, and those 10 turn to 100. I've come a long way in just the last 12 months because I've managed to get the ear of some influencers in the community that respect education over entertainment. So we're getting there. We're getting there.
Good. I want to kind of delve into just in this first podcast and kind of go into what you are largely becoming known for now, which is informing and educating those around a lower risk model of the use of anabolics and the viewpoint of, using this and going down this path, but having longevity at the forefront of our decision-making and having health at the forefront of our decision-making alongside progress and not necessarily progress above everything else.
I absolutely agree with that, because at the end of the day, I'm very much about outcomes. I don't see the point of spending the money, and I don't see the point of spending the time, and I don't see the point in raising your risk profile by any margin unless you're seeing a consequential outcome. So we have to see an outcome, but I would argue that, in 2021, we're really at the point now where we can look at 2 or 3 alternatives and make a decision about what alternative might be a better outcome for our health and longevity, but still provide a performance, increase. An increase in outcome in that regard. So,
So what if we open up the table now to kind of discuss what would constitute this lower risk model, and then discuss, in that context, what is causing an escalation in risk in the first place when we look at the use of anabolics as well?
Okay. So I think whenever you have a discussion about almost anything, context matters, and I think it's fair to say that elevation of risk is multifactorial. I don't think you can point to one thing and say, look, like if we can eliminate that or we can modify that behavior, then everyone is going to live long and prosperous and healthy lives doing whatever they want. It's not one thing, but I would argue that there is a framework that you can put on the table that most people are able to just kind of follow along without any technical knowledge whatsoever. It's just purely based on logic, and that is traditionally in the world of performance enhancements, our tribe has basically used anabolic steroids almost as a monotherapy, if you consider it that way. Certainly in the 1970s, enhancement meant steroids. I think it's fair to say in 2021, most people are open to the idea that there are multiple metabolic pathways which could be modulated for a performance outcome. It's a matter of, okay, so do we have the tools, the drugs, and the knowledge and the understanding of how to modulate multiple metabolic pathways for outcome? The most obvious example that one has to immediately put on the table is the idea of, well, anabolic steroids and a drug like recombinant human growth hormone are different drugs. They're different compounds. They work on different metabolic pathways. And there is an argument to be made that, 1 + 1 = 3. There's a synergism between these two compounds that allows you to get a better outcome than just using one of those compounds. Certainly than just using growth hormone. I think that's fair. And it doesn't take very much technical understanding to know, well, a little bit of anabolic steroids and a little bit of recombinant human growth hormone has the potential to be better than just using anabolic steroids. Most people would acknowledge that. The challenge, of course, becomes then my argument is by using the two together, potentially we could use a little less steroids. And of course, that's the hurdle to overcome because many people bypass that level and they go, okay, so I'll take my steroids up to this threshold and then I'll start using the other metabolic pathways. But I would argue, well, why don't we introduce them earlier in the game? Yeah. Why don't we lower down some of these pathways where we're potentially using too much now and raise up some other metabolic pathways to achieve a balance, lower overall stress, lower overall risk, but at least equal outcomes, as it were. That's a challenge in itself because I think it's fair to say that most people would say if there are half a dozen metabolic pathways and we modulate them all moderately, then the stress that we would accumulate through the moderate modulation of the 6 pathways is less than we would get through getting out a 20-pound sledgehammer and just smashing as hard as we fucking can on the androgen receptor, which is, I'm honest, what most guys tend to do. They pick one of the pathways, the binding of a molecule to the androgen receptor and the consequential protein accretion that follows, and that's all they do, just smash as hard as they can on that pathway. So my entire framework would be premised around, and I know you guys, your audience is quite educated, so if I'm using language that is not going to be well received, please tell me. Yes, I will change my language. I think it's fair to say that if we can identify what those 6 different pathways are, there are at least 6 of them, and then ask the question is, so what might we modulate here in a more moderate fashion? Can we get a better outcome at a lower risk profile? And hopefully, again, most people could just follow the thread and go, well, you got my interest so far. I'm open to that without even knowing any more than that. That sounds reasonable. That sounds logical. And indeed, if someone said to me, which would I prefer, someone using multi-gram doses of anabolic steroids or less steroids and a little bit of growth hormone, a little bit of insulin, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, I will take the second path pretty much every day. Obviously, there's caveats to that, but in general. So let me just open up the flip side to that coin, because I very often preach this idea that if you can't talk about the good, the bad, the ugly of something, then you probably need to be very careful listening to that person because he's probably a zealot. So what's the downside to this model? The first downside is, without question, more to learn. The second is, without question, more moving parts. And the third downside would be potentially a greater cost of application. Just using anabolic steroids, drugs like testosterone and nandrolone, I'm honest, are dirt cheap compared to drugs like recombinant human growth hormone. So if someone was coming from the point of view, they said, look, I have got $50 a month US to spend on this, my pathway probably is not practical. That's a budget that allows you to take on some, well-worn, time-proven anabolic steroids like testosterone and nandrolone and perhaps some others. So yeah, it's a more expensive model. But I believe that people are willing to listen to that model and consider that model, if they can see the plausible benefit over the long term. It's at least a certain percentage of the tribe. Okay.
Would you agree that for those people that maybe go into it saying, I've only got this amount that I can spend, because I've definitely known people that have that sort of mindset approach.
Mm-hmm.
I would always, and I know Cal's probably said the same, like ward them off it, purely because let's say you did pick a cheaper option in terms of the anabolic you use, but then when it comes to monitoring health and using, getting blood work done and some of the other things that you might need to do to kind of actually understand the effect it's having on your health and longevity, that's where, the money is often spent as well.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I said up front, I make no bones about it. I run a membership site to educate guys on this, and it's $15 US a month to be a member. And I shit you not, I have guys that say they can't afford it. I mean, that's a huge red flag to me. If you cannot afford $15 a month, you have no business fucking around with these drugs, in my opinion. It's a case of you don't value it. I don't respect what you have to say. That's fine. I've got thick skin. You don't value what I have to say, but I can't. I love what you have to say. I want to learn more about what you have to say, but I can't afford $15 a month. I'm going, red flag. You shouldn't be fucking around with these things, because the cost of doing this is not insignificant to doing it right. When you go through the process, you know, I'm not joking when I say, okay, so it's not just the drugs, as you correctly said, it's the regular ongoing health monitoring, but there's even certain practices that I would support, like the use of, you know, some antioxidants and things like that add to that cost. This is not a poor man's sport. This is certainly not a rich man's sport, but it's if you're you know, living hand to mouth sort of thing, I would encourage, you know, to basically consider maybe, you know, what I call a sportsman TRT. I'm not saying don't use steroids, but I'm saying a little bit of testosterone, place yourself outside of normal range, and a little bit of this, a little bit. I don't have a problem with that, but even that is like, you know, come back and see me when you have a discretionary income that matches any other sport. I mean, it doesn't matter what sport you play, whether it's cycling or whether you play golf or whatever like that, you're going to have to spend some money on the tools of the sport to reach what I would call a state national type level. During recreational use is a little different. So yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that statement, Drew. So maybe I'll just start. I said to you before we began, the interesting thing about these types of discussions is we could probably sit here and talk for an hour about the 6 metabolic pathways and how we might modulate them. And we could consume the entire, you know, the call on just that. So let me just very quickly run through what they are so people at least have an understanding. I don't want to say da-da-da and then walk away. So, of course, there's the classic genomic pathway where we have a molecule, you know, testosterone and one of its derivatives that binds with the androgen receptor. Gene transcription follows that ultimately results in protein accretion. This is what most people would associate with performance enhancement. Then there's the non-classic genomic pathway, which basically means those same molecules that are having action on the body off of the androgen receptor. Okay, so they're doing other things within the body that are not basically the androgen receptor inside the cell. Now, that may be androgen receptors on the cell membrane itself, and that is different, or it may be through other mechanisms, but there is both classic and non-classic genomic pathways. There's the pathway, the estrogen receptor itself, which is not well understood, is a hypertrophic pathway in its own right. Of course, the growth hormone IGF-1 insulin discussion, the beta-2 androgenic receptor pathway, and then less well understood and certainly far more speculative, we have the entire discussion about myostatin inhibition. But myostatin inhibition is something that I'm very interested in because it's certainly something that is being researched heavily for age-related muscle wasting type conditions, because you have the potential to have, treatment in diseases like muscular dystrophy and age-related muscle wasting without many of the consequences of the application of androgens. So when you look at all of those, the whole argument is, well, what will we do if we turn the volume up just by a small margin across all of these pathways, rather than, as I said, just getting out a sledgehammer and smashing on the androgen receptor? That's in a nutshell what the safer use model means. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if you can imagine, if you accept the fact that, say, 200 milligrams a week of testosterone, and I say this on the premise that TRT is considered 2 milligrams per kilogram. So a man like myself, it would not be unreasonable to start at, say, 200 milligrams a week, and then, of course, titrate for effect, right? If that's HRT, then you can make a pretty good argument that in certain individuals, say 300 milligrams a week is very, very well tolerated. I mean, the amount of stress consequential of that is so marginal that potentially you never have to stop. Now, I'm not saying for everybody, I'm saying for individuals that tolerate it well and demonstrate that. Now, could you stop there and say, I'll take no more testosterone and just start twiddling the other knobs? Yeah, you could make that argument. Most people would consider that to be, well, you haven't even started the androgen discussion, whereas some people might have actually stopped at that point. And this is what I call the supernatural man model. There's no way that you can argue that's natural levels of testosterone. They are super physiological, and you're seeing the benefits of it, but the stress associated with it is, let's say, tolerable. Let's call it tolerable.
It reminds me of it's something I've spoken about the last couple of days with people, and it's from a mechanics perspective that in a mechanical from a mechanical perspective, like stress can be defined as force per unit area. So obviously, the more force going through a smaller like area is going to be more stressful, and if we can spread that force out over a greater surface area,
It's a very good analogy. Absolutely.
Yeah. So and it's like you stand on a nail, it's going to hurt. If you lie down on a bed of nails, it's not going to, you're going to be able to deal with it. So that seems to be kind of the model that we're kind of talking about, right?
And of course, absolutely, it's a very good observation. It's a very good analogy. And of course, that's not how we do things. We come straight out the gate in our tribe with, you need 600 milligrams of testosterone to even start, right? And then 600 becomes 750, and 750 becomes 1,000. And by the time you get to your second cycle, you're at 1,000 milligrams of test a week. And then you keep pushing that up until you reach the point of toxic return, where you get diminishing therapeutic benefit, the toxicology kicks in. And then you go to the next one and you turn the HGH up until the point whereby you're starting to see consequence of that behavior, insulin resistance and the such like. And then you get to the insulin, turn the insulin up all the way. It's a completely different model. It does challenge people's thinking, though, because you have to appreciate the fact that a lot of people are going to say, well, if I took 300 milligrams of testosterone out the gate, nothing's going to happen. You have to be astute enough to say that's just not supportable. That statement is not supportable, not in the clinical evidence that we have that shows the increase in lean muscle tissue mass in men that take 300 milligrams, nor is it an observation. During thousands and thousands and thousands of people, I've titrated the dose, and the moment they cross the supralogical physical barrier, you start to see consequential changes to physiology. It doesn't miraculously happen at, in 2,000 nanograms per deciliter. It starts the moment you start to raise androgens. So it does challenge people's thinking. It's not the way things are done. And so therefore there's a certain part of our tribe that will embrace it readily. And there's certain people that's going to take a very, very long time to reach a tipping point before the light bulb goes off and they go, I get it. So, but we are getting there. We are getting there. So, yeah. So those are the quick rundown of the 6 pathways. Now, how would we go about that in detail, in prescriptive form? Well, again, that's what I said to you before. I'm more than happy to have a podcast, but we could consume an entire hour just talking about that. No, I won't do that to you.
In light of that model, how does that change the thought process in regards to, if you got advice from the typical big guy in your gym and he's going to say, right, we're going to go on a 16-week cycle of this. If we're using this approach that does supply more longevity in regards to extending that diminishing return over time, so we're able to make progress for longer periods of time while still in control of our health, how does that change the thought process on how we're periodizing, say, a year's worth of programming for an athlete or an individual, whether advanced or amateur, in regards to when we're creating periods of time where anabolics are escalated, when we need to pull back? Is it just purely on blood work? Like, how would you view that as a thought process?
Yeah, can I circle back around there, because that's probably the most challenging group to address. The easiest group to guys address are the guys that are doing TRT now.
Yeah.
Right. So they're already using testosterone, and they may well be using some ancillaries that are supportive of this discussion already. Okay. And if you talk to them and they say, well, listen, I started at 150 milligrams, 160 milligrams a week. And I shouldn't have, but I turned the volume up myself a little bit. And I got to 200. And I noticed that as I turned the volume up, as I titrated up, that I started to see an improved return for my efforts. How do you feel about me, Victor, going to 250 a week? You understand, like that part of the tribe find it very easy to say, look, I'm seeing benefits, but just a little bit more. Can I turn it up a little bit more? And those people are really seeking, what we'll go opening the door into the world of enhancement, not quality of life. So if you see TRT through the filter of this is about, libido, about quality of life outcomes, then as we turn the volume up, we start talking about enhanced outcomes, not natural outcomes. So those guys are really seeing it from the point of view of like, I'm going to turn the volume up and I'm never going to periodize. I'm never stopping. I'm just, I might turn it up, say 250 or 300 a week and leave it there for years and years and years on end is the argument. Now, do we have clinical data to support that? Absolutely. Through the testosterone and its derivatives drugs as male contraceptives, they have given drugs at those dosages to males for very long and extended periods of time, seeking that outcome. So we have evidence to support more than TRT. Yeah, we have that evidence. So that's a very easy group to address. And if I'm honest, that's probably more the people that follow me now because they can just connect with it, right? Whereas it's a big jump then to get into the guys that are used to having periodized cycles of blast and cruise because it's a mind shift. But I would argue that you could take, a compromised position. I'll give you an example. Right now I'm working with Joe Jeffrey, as you know, and he's had a fabulous year, thanks to, in large part to your guys' help with his training programming and the input you guys have had. But I think it's fair to say that, we aren't messing around with granddad's TRT here, but with very careful selection of compounds and things like that. He goes and get blood. When he comes back, he's not carrying stress.
Yeah.
Do you know? So when you look at his blood work, it's very hard to make the argument of, well, why would he stop? Like traditionally we've stopped because bro law says you run a cycle for so many weeks and you stop. But literally, what was that based on? I have no fucking idea. Someone just made it up, basically, right? My philosophy is it's only reasonable to assume that an individual will see stress consequential to the elevation of these drugs, right? And so we need to look for it, right? And when we see it, we respond. But we don't need to respond unnecessarily. So in other words, if your blood pressure, if your blood glucose, if your capacity to manage these at that level, if your kidneys are not demonstrating stress, if your liver's not demonstrating stress, if your cardiac and vasculatory system is not demonstrating stress, if your prostate, not that it would if you understand the saturation theory, but if all of these things are saying, look, I'm kind of doing okay, there's a very strong argument to say, well, you can, in theory, keep going. Obviously, there is some speculation involved in that, but I would rather someone took that model that said, listen, the difference between a model so great in magnitude that over the next 6 months, my kidneys are going to get smashed, my liver's going to get smashed, my lipids are going to get smashed, and then I'm going to take 4 months off to try and fix all that shit, versus here's a guy like Joe that we've got the volume turned up. There's no denying the volume's turned up, right? But not to the magnitude that anything is getting quote unquote smashed here.
Mm.
So again, this is where you have to stand in this world of saying, well, there's the clinical evidence that we can look at. Do I have a study to support this? No, there's no study out there that says that's acceptable behavior. But this is in the world that we're in. We say, okay, so option A is have the volume so high, I can literally see the stress of my kidneys through blood work. Do I have to stop? You bet your ass you have to stop. You have to stop and then wash that stress off and then ask yourself, what damage did you do during that process? Because kidneys are very sensitive. They don't really regenerate very nicely the liver does. So you have to fix it and then basically move forward. And in a lot of ways, that is really what the periodization of drug strategies is. It's the creation of so much stress that you have to stop at some point and wash it off and then go again. Yeah. Whereas you could make an argument that, let's say you turn the volume down to 50% of that or 70% of that, by a large enough margin that you minimize the stress that it wasn't visible, could you extend that cycle duration from 20 weeks to 30 weeks? I would argue, my opinion is yes. This is my opinion, yeah? And that opinion is based on, as I said, 30 years of watching guys that are taking what I consider to be too high risk models, saying, hey, take your fucking foot off the gas. No greater example than me. I've been doing this so long. One of the reasons I get away with it is because I just don't go there. I'm not saying that I'm walking around on TRT. That's completely disingenuous, but I'm walking around on models that I cannot see the stress in blood work. I cannot see the stress in, I measure my blood pressure, it's within range. I measure my glucose, it's in range. I measure my, echocardiogram. I go through all the tools that you would use to measure stress, and I would say, I'm not delusional enough to say there isn't a margin of stress, but it's not of a great enough magnitude that I'm able to pick it up through pathology. Mm-hmm. And I'm willing to accept that as an enhanced user, rather than I'm going to push so fucking hard I can see my kidneys hurting and then stop. Yeah. So, which is, I mean, we laugh, but let's face it, because of what I talk about, a very large percentage of people that have bad blood work come to me. And I see shit that I just go, holy shit, dude! Like, how the hell did you end up there? Do you know? So it is absolutely, unequivocally possible to have an enhanced outcome, a not natural outcome, and in certain individuals, be able to say you're not experiencing unreasonable levels of stress, and you can continue forward.
Yeah.
I think that's a reasonable position to take.
I've seen that firsthand from having this last kind of 15 or 16 months now with Joe, you know, with from an anabolic perspective from my side, and the back end of prep when I prepped in 2018, you know, the usage in that prep was significantly higher pre-show,
2 or 3 times
than it ever got, you know, in this last phase. And like, I don't mind saying, like, the last 18 months or the last 16 months since that show, test has never gone higher than 300 meg. And we escalated my primo up to just over.
I'm more than happy to disclose to anyone that is interested. I won't disclose the whole thing because Joe hasn't given me permission to do that. Yeah. So, but yeah, I agree with you. Joe's testosterone, he's taking 300 milligrams of test. That's what he's taking.
Yeah.
That's it. Why do you need 1,000? Who said you need 1,000? I don't think he's ever been in a point where he's seen relentless month-on-month progression at the cumulative rate that he is now. I think there's probably certain months where you can go, that month way back in 2017 May, I had the fucking month of all months. Fair enough. But to me, what matters is month after month after month after month after month, relentlessly progressing towards our goals.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's taking 300 milligrams of testosterone. That's what he's taking. People think, hey, you're fucking lying. No, that's what he's taking. Right now, that's not all he's taking, but that's how much testosterone he's taking. And I think he's honest enough to say, I think he's been as high as 1,200 milligrams a week, probably more. Why do you need to go that high? It doesn't make sense. So how are we doing this? Well, we're not just modulating the androgen pathway. It's not just anabolic steroids we're using.
The thing that I find ironic is if you tell someone to take a gram of test, they'll be happy with it. If you tell someone to take 20 IUs of Lantus, they'll freak out. Yep. And it's looking at the relationship between obviously stimulating these different pathways, but because they're new or because they're potentially misunderstood, they see it as a massive risk, whereas they don't see the androgen elevation as a massive risk. And that's obviously quite a skewed way of thinking.
Yeah, I agree. And they're not new. It's just not well understood in our tribe.
Yeah.
Now, none of these drugs are new drugs. They've been in human clinical use for. One of my great passions is trying to steer people away from veterinary drugs and research chemicals. We have such fabulous clinical data on the drugs like insulin and growth hormone and anabolic steroids. I just don't see the value in using, raising the risk threshold through what I call the unknown factor. Using drugs that we just, I'm not saying good, I'm not saying bad, I'm just saying we just don't know. So why would you take the risk?
Yeah.
Stick with the drugs that we can, sit down and have a very credible, detailed discussion about hundreds of studies done in human beings and look at the good, the bad, the ugly, rather than, here's a drug that holds some promise, but, has never even been tested in a fucking rat. Like, why would you be interested in using that? Now, don't get me wrong, technically fascinating if you want to talk about it. I think it's very interesting, but why would you actually deploy it at this point? It doesn't make sense. There's not enough clinical evidence to support that decision.
Yeah. So if you were working with a client or a consult client, Vic, what would be the kind of fundamental toolbox in what you're using to monitor health alongside blood work? What will be the daily metrics that you'd be looking at to see, whether this individual is in a place where we can crack on or whether we potentially need to start pulling back?
I don't think that the points I'm going to touch on here are going to surprise anybody, but what surprises me is the number of people that come to me and I say, do you have a blood pressure monitor? And they don't own one.
Yeah.
They just don't even fucking own one. Like, no. Do you have a glucose monitor? No. So that 5 years of androgen experience and they don't own a blood pressure monitor. So I would argue that the tools I use are probably not the surprise, just the fact that the sheer volume of individuals that step up for coaching that don't practice those tools. So I would say measuring our blood pressure, measuring our fasted blood glucose levels, obviously pathology on a regular basis. And I'm not interested in testosterone and estrogen levels. I want to see, how our kidneys are doing. people are always fascinated by. Sometimes I show blood work, and they always go, "Well, what was his test levels?" I don't give a rat's ass what his test levels are. If he's taking 300 milligrams of testosterone, we know. I think I want to show me his kidneys. Let me see his kidneys. You know? So I would say pathology. I would then say, regular echocardiograms. Then I would say the overall awareness of how these things manifest itself in real world through behaviors like poor sleep hygiene and libido and lethargy and et cetera, et cetera. So there are qualitative measurements that we measure, and then there's the subjective, how are you feeling? And then the final one would be how are you performing? I mean, you should be like fucking walking around like an asexual tyrannosaurus, and you should be walking around like just smashing personal bests in the gym. If those things are missing, something's astray. So it's. I don't think there's anything in that statement that people have learned anything from at all, except the fact the vast majority of people don't monitor these things. Yeah. Even things like acne. You got acne. Acne is consequential to oxidative stress. That's what's causing it. That's not good. Let's address why that is. Why are you experiencing cutaneous oxidative stress?
It's a valid point. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. For those that have studied oxidative stress and the effects that have, I mean, if that's like you can use that as kind of an indicator.
It's like a blow-off valve. It's a little bit that you see. Like we were talking about, the idea of raising the subject of androgens and hair loss, maybe. And I think that's a fascinating subject, but it's so much a call in itself. But if I could just touch on it briefly, I would say the great majority of people don't understand what underlies hair loss as connected to the use of androgens, and that is, you have to begin with an understanding that the applications of androgens is directly correlated to increase in hair growth on 99% of the body, right? So, if you give androgens to women, they grow hair. They don't lose their hair. They grow hair. There's only one part of your body, which is right at the top of your scalp, that you see a hair loss issue. So you have to ask the obvious question. So what is the difference between the hair follicle at that site and the hair follicle at that site, where that hair follicle grows and that hair follicle shrinks and dies? There must be a reason that's happening. And the reason it's happening is because first you start off with, chronic tension to the scalp. Chronic tension to the scalp leads to basically chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation leads to oxidative stress. Oxidative stress leads to greater impact from androgens on the hair. So I'm not dismissing the role of androgens, but there's a cascade of events that occur. Okay. And again, if you can get underneath it, if you can address the oxidative stress through the application of antioxidants and scalp massage and micro rollers and all these sorts of things, you're actually getting in front of the issue of DHT, the action of that androgen on that hair follicle, right? So this is why there's so much research to look at all of these, possible treatment methodologies for hair loss. But in reality, hair loss is multifactorial, and the only logical treatment model is a little of all of them. So, you need to ask, okay, so how do I lower chronic tension of the scalp? Well, massage is a good place to start. And then maybe a micro roller, like the little kind of needly roller thing, sort of thing. And then you'd go, okay, so what's the next thing? Chronic inflammation. How can I lower inflammation at a site-specific location? And then, antioxidants, and how can I apply those topically to my hair? And even if you look at things like minoxidil, this is a vasodilator. It's all about blood flow to the hair. This is not some sort of thing. If you look at the treatments that are known, there's good information that shows promise with scalp massage and derma rollers and things like vasodilators and the application of melatonin topically to the hair. All of these things have clinical fragments of evidence, but I would argue so the solution is a kind of a collection of all of those behaviors. So this morning when I went and got my Thai massage, the guy spends 10 minutes massaging my scalp because I want the blood and everything to be getting into that scalp. That's one step. Now, I'm not delusional enough to think that 10-minute massage is the treatment for baldness, but what I'm saying is in some meaningful way, it's contributing to my treatment methodology.
Yeah.
In some meaningful way. So again, this is part of the challenge is my philosophy says usually when you see an issue, the reason that you see something is typically multifactorial. It's not one thing. And therefore, just rationally and logically, if there's clinical evidence to support, well, it might be that, and it might be that, and it might be that. Well, the answer is probably, just honestly, well, the treatment model needs to be multifactorial. At no greater example, I don't know whether you guys know it or not, but there's relatively recently been some tremendous breakthrough work with Alzheimer's disease. And, the problem is that it's not a treatment model, it's a lifestyle intervention. So you take people and you feed them better and start exercising them and getting them out and about using their brains. And then you add the drug candidates on top of that and the magic happens. Whew, right? But everyone's looking for a drug that treats Alzheimer's. That's not how it works. It's multifactorial. You have to put all these things together. And then when you do, you see something quite extraordinary happen. So you control glucose levels and you increase exercise rate, and you do this and you do this and you do this, and they have seen tremendous benefits from a multifactorial approach to Alzheimer's, where every single drug candidate they push up against with just kind of pushes back on them. And that's the reason. A drug by itself is never going to cure Alzheimer's disease. You have to have a lifestyle intervention along with it. So hair loss to me is no different. It's the reason we lose hair is multifactorial. How we address it is multifactorial. And people need to be then going, okay, I'm trusting enough to say, well, that makes fucking sense. They're showing me the clinical literature that supports each of these treatment models and show me enough magnitude of benefit to each of these things for me to be interested in considering one of those, that in my whole treatment plan. Yeah. So
I think that could be
took us a long way off the track there. Apologies.
Podcast in itself, didn't it?
No, it's interesting because it's like it comes back to that whole, force per unit area and like that. It just seems to be kind of such a key consideration in all these areas. And I'm thinking like back to the periodization stuff you mentioned, Carl. I mean, the amount of because training is a stress itself, right? So when people kind of take that approach of let's take a more like stressful approach from a PED usage perspective, and then on top of that let's apply even more stress from the training because I'm expecting that I'm going to have to push harder, so they drive volume up and maybe train a bit more recklessly, so they're kind of contributing to their like total allostatic load in this massive way. And we know like even from a training perspective it can have negative effects on certain areas of physiology that like anabolics would too, like livers and things like that, we'd see certain elevated enzymes and stuff. So I imagine that's potentially part of the problem with those combined models of, okay, let's smash gear and drive stress up that way. And let's also smash my training and drive stress up that way. And they'll contribute potentially to each other.
And it needs to be said, Luke, if you look at the literature, that you cannot deny it, the amount of people that use drugs in this class are also recreational drug users is mind-boggling. Truly mind-boggling. They can't seem to pick their poison. They smoke cigarettes and they drink alcohol and they use, I've got nothing. You do whatever the hell you want to do, but just pick your poison. You can't do all of these things because all stress is cumulative. Yeah. And you only have to look at like bodybuilders. So bodybuilders get an injury, then they start taking pain medication because they don't want to stop. They can't afford the pain medication. They, very quickly end up on opioids. I mean, you only have to look back at some of the behaviors in the 90s. There were a great many very high profile bodybuilders that were basically addicted to opiates. Do you mean? And that's even it's completely off track, but very often you'll hear these arguments about, okay, so the conditioning was better in the 90s. Yeah, but also some of the drug use was very, very, very questionable back then. And you have to ask, how did they get into those positions? A lot of the drugs that they used, you could argue, actually assisted them as appetite suppressants and things like that I would not recommend. Yeah. I would say, do not go down that path, but like understand if you did, is it plausible that you could potentially leverage that to affect for conditioning outcome? Yeah, because they're fucking appetite suppressants. So it's a very complicated discussion, but again, this comes down to even like, recommendations to paper. Pick your poison, just pick your poison. Like, I think that the human body is able of remarkable feats of regeneration, and you can apply a certain amount of stress and get away with it, but you have to pick your stress. You can't be a binge drinker. You can't be a smoker. You can't be a recreational drug user and a user of these drugs and think that there is not a consequence of the accumulation of those outcomes. And yet all of the individuals that are involved in, like, for example, the music festival scene. They're not, but they just want to look good for the weekend so they can go to the club and dance and stuff like that. And then when they go to the club, they engage in these behaviors. And again, I'm not trying to judge those behaviors. I'm simply saying, understand that behavior plus that behavior, 1 + 1 = 3. As long as you understand it, I'm not your mother.
Mm.
Yeah.
Because they're maybe just looking at the anabolic side. Yeah, but I'm not, not thinking that much. Maybe like, yeah, but now you're doing all this other shit.
Sure. And you only have to look at the studies like the SARM studies. I mean, like, a lot of people think I'm very harsh on SARMs. There have been a couple of studies where individual participants in SAM studies have been pulled out of SARM studies because of unreasonable levels of liver stress. In those studies, those people were drinking as well. You know, so in other words, the SARMs seemed reasonably well tolerated at the doses tested. A couple of individuals had liver stress that was of concern, so they withdrew the applicants. But there's a little footnote: alcohol was consumed by this participant. You know? So again, you have to look at that. What might seem well tolerated in clinical literature is not necessarily true with that other stressor on the table.
Yeah. Very interesting.
So, this is probably way too broad to even ask in this context, but one of the things I wrote down, and this probably probes into potential topics that we could discuss in greater length when we get you back on, but if we were to probe and open the table now, what do you feel as though maybe 2 or 3 areas are the biggest misunderstood elements of the practice of anabolics, in terms of whether one of the examples I gave you before was the reliance on aromatase inhibitors to modulate estrogen without looking at potentially the statin design as a whole. Is there anything that screams out right now that you're thinking, that you're looking at, that you think, this needs to change?
I think that's a great example, but I also think it's fair to say that come a long way with that discussion.
Yeah.
Do you know? I remember when I was talking about this like 5 years ago, people were like, I'm serious, like the shit I used to get like was ridiculous, right? We've come a very long way with people understanding that estrogen is not the enemy.
Yeah.
Okay. In fact, estrogen is your best friend. When we raise androgens, the consequence of raising the androgens, elevated androgens is not good for your brain. Elevated androgens is not good for your heart. Elevated androgens is not good for your kidneys. It's the consequential elevation of estrogen that follows that is your body's way of mediating that stress. Estrogens are protective, cognitive protective. Estrogens protect your kidneys against the damage of high androgens. Estrogen is your friend. Why the fuck you would be modulating estrogen, I have no idea. Estrogen self-modulates. It's a biological protective process, but I do feel that we're getting to the point where even in the TRT community, people get this now. Throw your fucking AI in the bin. In other words, start at clinical dose testosterone, because guys always ask me, well, how the hell do I do it? So you start off at the clinical dose of testosterone, 2 milligrams per kilogram, and then slowly raise the dose of testosterone so you get to the point where you can use as much testosterone as you can tolerate as a genetically unique individual without having estrogen or DHT-related side effects. Now, for most men, that number is between 300 and 400 milligrams a week, right? From that point forwards, we introduce drugs that are going to continue us down our journey, but don't add more estrogen or don't add more DHT. Like an example would be a drug like Masteron or Primobolan or Anavar doesn't convert to estrogen, so we're adding our anabolics to the table without adding more estrogen. Just take it as far as you can tolerate it, and then just change drugs. Do you know? So it's very easy to fix. You know? And I think we get, so I completely agree with you, but I think we're getting to the point. The big thing that I'm on at the moment is that most people would see blood pressure medication as something that you don't want to take, which is completely the opposite. Even doctors, like, the number of guys that I've heard that saying, I'm trying to get my blood pressure down so I can get off this blood pressure medication. I'm saying, you need to get your blood pressure down, I agree with you, but then you want to take that ARB by default. Because the suppression of angiotensin 2, the effector molecule of the RAS system, the renin, angiotensin system, that is what underlies elevated blood pressure, but it's also what underlies elevated hematocrit levels. You don't need to donate blood; you need to control angiotensin 2. And the combination of high or elevated angiotensin 2 consequential to the application of drugs like testosterone and an aromatase inhibitor is like a nasty, nasty combination. Like you That's probably like the worst thing you could do for yourself, honestly. You should just run your estrogen as high as you can tolerate it, right? When you get to the point where you can't tolerate it anymore, stop taking drugs that add to the estrogen equation and move across to a drug that does not aromatize, okay? And then take an ARB by default. Men should be doing everything in their power to modulate angiotensin II, the effector molecule of the RAS system, whether they're using drugs or not. And I if you're natural, you may well take an approach that says, look, if I can control my blood pressure without a medication, that makes sense. I don't have a problem with that. But anyone that takes these drugs has to appreciate one of the consequences is we raise, angiotensin II. That is not a good thing, and you should be asking your doctor for a blood pressure medication, not trying to avoid one. Go to him, knock on his door, show him the clinical literature and say, I want you to prescribe me an ARB because I'm engaging this behavior. And if he won't do it, then find another doctor that will, right? So don't try and get off blood pressure medications, do everything in your power to get on them, just so people are clear. What's the downside of using an ARB? There are a few. So the big one is, it is very plausible that if you have low red blood cell count, you could potentially lower that even further and risk becoming anemic. That is not our tribe, my guys. We're donating blood to lower, RBC. So the fact that an ARB lowers hematocrit, this is not a problem for us. We're not going to become anemic. It's going to give us normal levels of hematocrit. So yeah, I would say the big push I'm on at the moment is trying to get everyone that uses super physiological levels of androgens to ask their doctor for the prescription of an ARB by default, whether they have high blood pressure or not. You need to suppress angiotensin II. And there's lots and lots and lots and lots of things to read about angiotensin II, and it doesn't take very much to understand, one, the angiotensin II is something we don't want elevated, and two, the application of these drugs elevates angiotensin II. This is not difficult to get to that point. It's just hard to communicate to the tribe. The second one I would say is, I guess I talk about this a lot, and that is choosing your drugs carefully. I'm just so not a fan of veterinary drugs. I'm so not a fan of what I call research chemicals. We have so many drugs that we could use for effect. I'll give you a simple example. There's a drug called GW1516. Most people are familiar with it. It went through some very interesting human clinical trials. It looked very promising. And the developers of this drug, Glaxo, decided to walk away from the drug because they had concerns over, long-term toxicity implications, right? I understand people's interest in that class of drugs. So then the obvious question asked is, well, that class of drug is very interesting and it may hold benefit to our tribe. Are there any other currently approved for use human drugs that do the same thing, that have effectively been through the same testing process and made it through? And the answer is, yeah, telmisartan. So telmisartan is a combination ARB and PPAR agonist, right, that was evaluated under the very same trials that GW1516 was, but it passed. It didn't fail. So why would you use a drug that has effectively the same mechanism of action, right? But one of those drugs passed human testing requirements for toxicology and one of them failed miserably. I don't know why you would do that. I just don't connect why you would do that. So if you need to use an ARB by default, and you're interested in the benefits of PPAR agonist, just ask your doctor to give you telmisartan because it is a hybrid drug. It's a combination of both of those things, rather than using a drug that was showing great promise in human trials, had to go through standardized toxicology testing, and consequently that testing failed. And that was 10 years ago. It's not like it happened recently and people are not aware of it. So I'm not a big fan of research chemicals when we have drugs that we can look at safety data that supports their safe and efficacious use. Now, if there's a drug out there that doesn't have a human approved equivalent, okay, then I'm a little bit more empathetic. I can kind of go, okay, well, I can see why you're picking at that thing over there, because you're interested in what it potentially offers, and there is no alternative. But when there is, you have to ask the question, why are you doing that? And very often it's pure ignorance. People just are not aware of what drugs actually do what. They're basing them on, some bloke down the gym said this is the good stuff. Yep. So, yeah, not a fan of recreational drugs when we have so many fabulous approved for human use drugs available to us.
Yeah, I like that a lot. One of the things I wanted to ask as well was, and I have an inkling of who might be on this list, but who have been the most influential people in your professional development as an expert in your chosen field to date?
That's an interesting one. There's probably two people that I need to give a shout out to. One is a guy called Dr. Scott Stevens. I mentioned him right at the beginning. I think Scott and I are not close, but he's certainly someone that has always, been very kind to me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, kudos, and like, I like what you're doing. And I think the reason I like Scott's work is because despite the fact that he holds a PhD, in a discipline relevant to this field, he doesn't live in an ivory tower. He's a practitioner. He's on the ground, basically. And I really appreciate that there is, in my opinion, at least, a very big difference between having academic qualifications and understanding what we're doing in the gym. I on times disagree with academia because I go, well, that may well be true under that set of circumstances, but you have to come and live with my world to basically appreciate my point of view. And it doesn't mean that I'm undermining their qualifications. I just don't think they understand what we're up to. Yeah. And I think Scott, is just a great example of someone that lives in both worlds. Really deserves credit for that. Sometimes speaks about performance enhancing drugs, but is probably better known for his, fortitude training type, educational content. I understand he doesn't talk as much as I do about enhancement, but the other guy I need to give a shout out to is Dr. Scott Howe, who is not very well known in our community, but there is I've done a couple of podcasts with him, and there's some podcasts on my YouTube channel. Is anyone interested? Especially, I just recently posted a really interesting podcast he did 2 days ago on testosterone with who's the guy from Starting Strength, Ripto? Is that Mark Ripto? I think. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, and Scott has touched me because he's always patting me on the shoulder saying, "Good job," and it's just really nice to have someone that's like a bona fide androgen researcher, someone from that tribe saying, listen, like that's how it's done. You read things, you don't get hooked up on one study, you'll argue the merits of a study, you can always refute a single study. You got to look at the entire body of evidence, and he appreciates what I'm trying to do. And just the fact that he pats me on the shoulder every now and again, he sends me in the right direction, shows me a paper or something like that. Both of these guys I will always have a great deal of gratitude for, and anyone that doesn't follow them, I highly recommend you follow both of them. I probably, to be honest with you, put out more interesting content than both of them publicly, yeah, but two individuals that should be on everybody's follow list, absolutely, without question, in my opinion. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, cool. Sweet. Talk us through your own kind of resources then, Vic. So I know that you've got, it's 2 membership sites now, one male and then the enhanced female one as well, right?
Yeah. So just this week, literally on Wednesday, the 3rd of February, 2021, I launched the first female specific site for enhancement called enhancedwomen.com. So it's literally like hot off the press. I unashamedly feel that women get the rough end of the stick in this game. There's a lot of guys talking about enhancement practices for men. They're not necessarily talking about the safer application, but they talk about it. But women are very, very much treated as like secondary to that. Very often you see a forum and they'll have like a folder on the back, for women's discussions, something tucked away. Something. And I just thought, like I felt I owed it to that community to create a resource that was specifically geared towards female use and the very, very big differences between the application of these practices in men and women. So yes, enhancedwomen.com. And then, as I said, I've been running the Victor Black Masterclass for men for a number of years now. Slowly starting to get traction in that space. Both of these are membership sites. So unashamedly, the way the work is you pay a membership, much the same as you guys run a membership site. And every month I produce content on a drip-fed basis. And my job is to provide enough value and enough engagement with the people remain a member. You know, it's not a book, it's not a CD where you buy it once and it's done. It's an ongoing, constantly being developed resource that my job is to provide enough value each month that you continue to stay a member and pay the $15 a month every month. So yeah, I welcome anyone that is interested in. There's enough free I provide enough free content to people to, like this podcast, like you do. You know, there's enough free content out there for people to know what I'm all about, to at least lay down $15. Both of the sites cost $15. Lay down $15 a month and try it for a month. If you get to the end of the month and you don't think it's for you, then you spent $15. Big deal. Doing. If you do, you know, maybe I have a follower for life.
Yeah, I think anyone, a coach or individual, whether, you know, amateur, you know, dealing with athletes, whatever it might be, if you are in the field of being involved with anabolics, then this stuff is really a non-negotiable.
100%. Yeah, totally relate to everything you said there in terms of the way that product's been built and kind of the commitment you've made to kind of keep it ongoing and up to date.
Yeah, so the only frustration I have is, for some reason, people want it. I know why people want it, but they want like a singular resource they consume one time. But I look behind and I see that bookshelf of content that you have there. You know, and it's like, you can't buy a book on a subject and read it and consume it from cover to cover, even if you absorb every word, right? And consider yourself to have the final word in everything. It's just a book, right? And this is why I try to convince people that I think books are great. I think, you know, webinars and seminars are great. I think podcasts are great, but I think that ongoing education is something that you need to immerse yourself in for a couple of hours a month, every single month. Right? Really, when I say a couple of hours, I spend thousands of hours. But the point is, like, you know, if you just had a book off that, you know, you randomly drawn from that bookshelf, doesn't give you enough information to say, I know everything there is to know on that subject. I don't see a book fulfilling the role of a membership site in that regard. So I try to convince people that, you know, it's $15 to open the door, and once you come in, I will try to service you, you know, at least giving you that value each month.
And I mean, that's the intention behind why we made ours, is that
Absolutely.
kind of encourages the ongoing commitment to education.
Correct.
One off, I paid for the course, I'm done. You're like, no, this is like, stay in it, keep going.
Yep.
Half an hour a day.
It's for the duration of your career.
yeah. As long as you want to, you know, it says, you know, as long as you want to take responsibility for putting forces through people, you know, advising them on their nutrition habits, and in this case, like, potentially giving advice in this area, like, you've got to know what you're doing.
Agreed.
100%.
Yeah.
Where can we find you then, Vic, in terms of website, social media? Where can we find you?
I think the easiest one, I've got a little patch on my screen up there that says @Victor Black Masterclass. So if you go to, I've just recently been through a huge learning curve myself, better understanding social media marketing and things like that. And I think it's fair to say that historically, I've really focused on Facebook as the means of reaching out to people. But I think that it's fair to say that young people have probably have abandoned, you know, to some extent, at least Facebook. And, you know, it's still a valuable, you know, social network for older people. And I have certain, you know, appeal to people who are, you know, enhanced and looking for, you know, okay, so more than TRT, but I am shifting my focus, and I have shifted my focus in the last couple of months across to Instagram. So I think that's the best one to promote, @Victor Black Masterclass at Instagram. If you just go there, I kind of then divvy out the different links to different resources in my in my world from that point.
Awesome.
And you mentioned you had a YouTube as well. Is that simply just Victor Black?
Yeah, I would go off that as well. If you go to YouTube and type in Victor Black Masterclass, you'll arrive at that location. That's kind of the common thread that I use across all my social media: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all of them. Yeah.
Cool. Epic.
Cool.
That was awesome.
Yeah, that was. Thank you for coming on, man. That was a lot of information, but very kind of engaging and practically applicable, which is very
Thank
good.
you. I appreciate that. As I said, if you are interested in, you know, after a little bit of version 2 or something like that, coming back and drilling down into any of those areas a little further, like with you know, questions from individuals. One of the things I'm very interested in is, I think it's fair to say that you guys are, you know, you see things, you know, through the eyes of the experience, but I'm very interested in what people who are following you want to know about. Do you mean? So I don't know whether there's an opportunity just to, you know, get some questions and answers, you know, not necessarily even from this show, but like, you know, let's get some questions before we do the show to make sure that we're, you know, addressing the questions that people that follow you want to know. So however I can participate, however I can add value, I appreciate the opportunity. I'm happy to participate.
No, that's a fantastic idea. We'll put that to the community for sure.
So I think two that spring to my mind just from what we discussed, the hair loss one it will be a big one, I know, and the female specific one, although that could be several hours. Breaking that down into an hour and a bit would be awesome as well. So we'll definitely look into that and get you back on soon.
Okay. Thank you, guys. I appreciate the opportunity. Nice to talk. I mean, I see your faces more than I kind of hear the voices, so it's nice to put a voice to a face.
That's awesome.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
And that's a wrap for what was our 27th guest interview. We will be making the strong comeback now, and we've pledged to keep these going on a frequent basis, just like we had before. Because we know you guys absolutely love them. So we've got some really exciting guests coming on over the coming weeks. And I think both myself and Luca and the rest of the boys are really looking forward to getting this all over to you. So just a quick recap, just to share some of our fantastic sponsors who do support the podcast. Firstly, for all of your supplement needs, pardon the pun, supplement needs are our primary supplementation sponsor. You can use code Muscle Mentors at checkout to receive 10% off your order. Secondly, we have the finest blue blockers in the land from Ra Optics, again using code Muscle Mentors at checkout. And lastly, our new is a relatively new announcement actually, our food prep sponsor Precision Prep, who is a new UK-based food prep sponsor who deliver both standard meal packs and also bespoke meal prep, including the new Pro Prep range, which is essentially a cooked quality organic protein option which you can pre-order, which will come frozen, and it is basically a cooked protein option that you can basically select from wild salmon, organic beef, organic chicken. There are other options coming where you'll be able to basically take into meal prep considerations like veggies and carbs. Just for more kind of single ingredient orders, it's something that I use a lot myself, and that again from a precision prep perspective is Muscle Mentors at checkout. Now that code for the Precision Prep website will get you 15% off your first order and then 10% off any order after that. So all of those sponsors is Muscle Mentors, nothing in between the muscle and the mentors, all lowercase, and that will grant you access to all of those discount codes. But thank you for listening, guys. I hope everyone is well, and we will be back soon.